world that women are not only equal to men, sometimes they are even more powerful. Hi, my beautiful family. I am Mr. Peter, present with you in love. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of women, my sisters, mothers, and daughters. They are the strength of every home, the light of every heart. Bless them with peace, health, and honor beyond measure. Wrap them always in your endless love. Amen. My family, this channel was built for us to stand together. Every view, every like, every comment gives life to my hard work. I know new members may find it hard to trust, but believe me, I am here with truth, with love, and with stories that come from my soul. If your heart is true, right, present. If your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. The cold marble beneath Jada Williams' trembling hands offered no comfort as another devastating contraction ripped through her body at 3 a.m., her desperate fingers fumbling with her phone, while Edward's drunken laughter echoed from the soundproofed game room below, completely oblivious to the life-and-death struggle happening just floors above. "Please, God, not like this," she whispered through gritted teeth, her rich brown skin glistening with perspiration as she gripped the ornate banister of their sprawling Atlanta mansion. The baby was coming whether Edward acknowledged it or not, and right now, her husband of 3 years was too intoxicated by whiskey and business victories to notice his wife was fighting for both their lives. Jada had been enduring contractions since midnight, but Edward had dismissed her concerns with cruel indifference. "First babies take forever, Jada. Stop being so melodramatic," he'd sneered before returning to his high-stakes poker game with his wealthy associates. His mother, Genevieve Sterling Williams, had been even more callous, suggesting that Jada was manufacturing drama like she always does. Now, as excruciating pain tore through her lower back and abdomen, Jada understood with crystal clarity that she was utterly alone in this cavernous house that had never truly been a home. The $1,000 Egyptian cotton sheets in their master bedroom lay soaked with amniotic fluid, and the pristine marble floors that Edward loved showcasing to visitors felt like blocks of ice against her bare feet. She attempted calling Edward's cell phone again, only to hear it ring unanswered somewhere in the game room. The space was completely soundproofed, another of Edward's excessive renovations that now seemed like deliberate cruelty. Jada's phone displayed 3 missed calls to her best friend, Aurelia Cross, but Aurelia was pulling a double shift at Grady Memorial Hospital and wouldn't see the messages until dawn. The next contraction struck with such ferocity that Jada's vision dissolved into white-hot stars. She lost her footing entirely, sliding down several steps while her silk nightgown bunched around her waist. The pain transcended anything she'd previously experienced, a primal, earth-shattering force that made her understand why childbirth had terrified women throughout human history. Through tears of agony and desperation, Jada's trembling fingers navigated her phone screen, attempting to text Aurelia one final time. But in her pain-clouded state, she accidentally selected the wrong contact. Instead of reaching her best friend, she sent a frantic message to an unknown number. "Please help me. I'm in labor and completely alone. 2847 Magnolia Drive. Please, I'm terrified." The message reached Theron Amadeo, a 42-year-old self-made billionaire who had built his empire through sustainable technology and ethical real estate development. Theron was working late in his downtown Atlanta office, reviewing architectural blueprints for a new community center he was personally funding in an underserved neighborhood. When his phone buzzed with the unexpected message, his first instinct was to dismiss it as a misdirected text. However, something about the raw desperation in those words prevented him from simply deleting the message. Theron had grown up in crushing poverty in rural Alabama, raised by a single mother who had frequently faced medical emergencies without support. The thought of a woman in labor with no assistance triggered something profound in his moral core. He immediately tried calling the number, but Jada was experiencing another contraction and couldn't respond. Without a moment's hesitation, Theron grabbed his car keys and entered the address into his GPS. Magnolia Drive was located in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods, the type of area where residents typically had abundant resources. But desperation recognized no economic boundaries, and Theron had learned long ago that wealth didn't guarantee compassion. Meanwhile, Jada had managed to crawl toward the front door, her body's instincts telling her the baby's arrival was imminent. She made one last desperate attempt at the game room door, weakly pounding with her fist, but the music and masculine laughter continued without interruption. Edward's voice penetrated the heavy wood, offering a toast to success and understanding your proper place in this world. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Jada. 3 years earlier, she'd been a thriving graphic designer with her own successful studio in Midtown Atlanta. She'd met Edward at an exclusive art gallery opening, where he'd been genuinely charmed by her intelligence and creative vision. He'd pursued her with relentless determination, overwhelming her with expensive gifts and promises of a life where financial security would never be a concern. What Edward had carefully omitted was that his version of security came with invisible but unbreakable chains. After their wedding, he'd systematically convinced her to close her design business, arguing that his wife shouldn't need to work. He'd gradually isolated her from her support network, relocated her to this mansion 40 minutes from her old neighborhood, and methodically eroded her independence until she felt like an exotic bird in an extremely expensive cage. Now, lying on the unforgiving marble floor, Jada realized with devastating clarity that Edward's vast wealth meant absolutely nothing if he refused to care for her when she needed him most. The baby inside her seemed to sense her distress, movements becoming increasingly urgent as contractions arrived with frightening frequency. A gentle knock at the front door made Jada's heart surge with desperate hope. She called out weakly, and a deep, reassuring voice responded, "Ma'am, I received your text message. My name is Theron. I'm here to help you." Jada managed to unlock the heavy front door, and when it opened, she saw a tall black man with compassionate eyes and an expensive but unpretentious suit. Theron's expression immediately reflected deep concern as he assessed her condition. A young black woman obviously in advanced labor, alone and frightened in a mansion that could comfortably house dozens of families. "How far apart are your contractions?" Theron asked with gentle authority, kneeling beside her without any concern for his costly attire. "Maybe 90 seconds, Jada gasped. "The baby's coming and my husband, he refuses." She couldn't complete the sentence without dissolving into tears. Theron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm and completely reassuring. "We're getting you to a hospital immediately. I'm going to carry you to my car. Is that acceptable?" Jada nodded gratefully, and Theron carefully lifted her in his strong arms. She was shocked by how genuinely safe she felt with this complete stranger, safer than she'd felt in her own home for countless months. As he carried her to his elegant SUV, she noticed his personalized license plate, AMADEO1. Are you Theron Amadeo?" she asked weakly as he settled her carefully in the passenger seat. She'd heard Edward mention that name before, usually with a mixture of professional envy and personal resentment. Theron Amadeo was renowned throughout Atlanta as a self-made billionaire who'd risen from nothing and built an empire while maintaining an unshakable reputation for treating all people with dignity and respect. "Yes, ma'am, but right now I'm simply someone who's going to ensure you and your baby are completely safe," Theron replied, starting the engine while simultaneously calling 911 to alert the nearest hospital. As they navigated through the empty Atlanta streets, Jada found herself sharing intimate details with this stranger that she hadn't discussed with anyone in years. Perhaps it was the overwhelming pain, or perhaps it was the first genuine kindness she'd experienced in so long, but she told Theron about her deepest fears, her crushing loneliness, and her growing realization that her marriage was built on control rather than love. Theron listened without any trace of judgment, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand supportively when contractions struck. He shared poignant stories about his own mother's incredible strength and how the women in his life had taught him that authentic power came from elevating others, not subjugating them. By the time they reached Atlanta Presbyterian Hospital, Jada felt as though she'd known Theron for years rather than mere minutes. As the medical team rushed her toward labor and delivery, she caught his eyes one final time. "Thank you," she whispered with profound gratitude. "You saved both our lives." Theron smiled with gentle warmth. "No, ma'am. You saved yourselves by having the courage to ask for help when you needed it most." As the hospital doors closed behind the rushing gurney, Theron made a solemn promise to himself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, this remarkable woman and her child would never face them alone again if he could prevent it. He'd witnessed too much of his own mother's solitary struggles to walk away now. Inside the delivery room, Jada closed her eyes and focused entirely on the new life about to enter the world. She couldn't know it yet, but this night would mark the beginning of everything transforming, not just the arrival of her son, but the awakening of her own dormant strength and the beginning of a love story that would fundamentally change both their lives. The mistaken text message had become the most providential accident of her entire existence. Chapter 2. Angels in Expensive Suits. The first golden rays of dawn streaming through Atlanta. Presbyterian Hospital's windows illuminated the most beautiful sight Jada Williams had ever witnessed. Her newborn son's perfect face nestled against her chest, while the extraordinary man who had rescued them both maintained his vigil in the corridor, steadfastly refusing to abandon them even now. "He's absolutely magnificent," whispered Dr. Callista Reed, the compassionate attending physician who had immediately recognized Jada's emergency and ensured she received elite medical care typically reserved for the hospital's most prominent benefactors. Dr. Reed was an experienced woman in her 50s who had built her distinguished career on the principle that every birth deserved to be treated with profound dignity, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the mother's arrival. Jada gazed adoringly at her son's exquisite features, a harmonious blend of her own striking characteristics with barely perceptible hints of the father who had callously abandoned them during their most vulnerable hour. The baby's remarkably alert eyes seemed to sparkle with intelligence, as if he instinctively understood that he had entered the world under the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. "What name will you give him?" Dr. Reed inquired tenderly, efficiently monitoring both mother and infant's vital signs with the practiced expertise of someone who had delivered thousands of babies throughout her remarkable career. "Torin," Jada declared without a moment's hesitation. "Torin Atlas Williams. The first name means chief, and the second represents strength. He'll require both qualities to navigate the world ahead of him." The powerful name had crystallized in her mind during the most challenging moments of her labor, when she'd contemplated exactly what kind of extraordinary man she wanted her son to become. Courageous, fiercely independent, and absolutely never willing to abandon those who depended on him. Through the delivery room's pristine windows, Jada observed Theron Amadeo moving restlessly through the hallway, his typically immaculate suit now wrinkled and disheveled from their harrowing night together. He had maintained his protective presence throughout her entire labor experience, never intruding inappropriately, but always remaining immediately available should she require any assistance whatsoever. When the medical staff had initially attempted to dismiss him by claiming he wasn't officially family, Theron had quietly consulted with the hospital administrator, and mysteriously, all access restrictions had been completely eliminated. "That remarkable gentleman outside, Doctor," Reed observed, following Jada's appreciative gaze, has demonstrated extraordinary concern for your welfare. He's also personally guaranteed all your medical expenses and specifically requested that you receive our comprehensive Platinum Care package. I've never witnessed such generous behavior from someone with no familial connection to the patient. Jada's heart overflowed with profound gratitude and an emotion she couldn't quite identify. In a single 12-hour period, this complete stranger had demonstrated more authentic care and compassion than her own husband had shown throughout 3 years of marriage. Would you please invite him inside? I want him to meet Torin properly." Dr. Reed smiled warmly and stepped into the bustling hallway. Within moments, Theron appeared in the doorway, his characteristically confident demeanor transformed by raw, genuine emotion. When his eyes fell upon Jada cradling her newborn baby, tears began streaming down his face. "He's absolutely breathtaking, Jada," Theron said softly, approaching the hospital bed with the reverent caution of someone entering sacred, hallowed ground. "How are you feeling right now?" "Like I've survived the most important battle of my life, and we emerged victorious," Jada replied with an exhausted but radiant smile. "Theron, I want you to meet Torin Atlas Williams. Torin, this is the guardian angel who saved both our lives." Theron's breathing momentarily stopped as Jada carefully transferred the sleeping baby into his strong, protective arms. While he had certainly held numerous babies throughout his life, his business colleagues' children, his employees' newborns at various company celebrations, something about holding tiny Torin felt fundamentally, profoundly different. This precious child represented unlimited hope, magnificent new beginnings, and the kind of pure, unblemished potential that no amount of money could possibly purchase. "Hello there, little warrior," Theron whispered to the baby with infinite tenderness. "You have the most incredible, courageous mother in the entire world. She fought with the strength of 10 warriors to bring you safely into existence." As if somehow recognizing and responding to Theron's gentle voice, baby Torin slowly opened his bright eyes and appeared to focus intently on the man cradling him. In that transcendent moment, something extraordinary shifted within the room, an invisible but unbreakable bond forming between the three of them that completely transcended conventional definitions of family relationships. Their peaceful, sacred moment was brutally shattered by Edward Williams' explosive entrance as he burst through the delivery room doors with the entitled aggression of someone reclaiming stolen property rather than a new father meeting his firstborn son. "What the absolute hell is happening in here?" Edward roared, his voice razor-sharp with indignant fury and social embarrassment. He remained dressed in his rumpled clothes from the previous night's poker marathon, his expensive imported cologne completely unable to mask the lingering odors of whiskey and premium cigars. "Jada, do you possess even the slightest comprehension of how utterly humiliating this entire situation has been for me? I was forced to learn from the hospital staff that my wife had given birth in the middle of the night because she apparently couldn't wait for a civilized, reasonable hour." Edward's hostile gaze immediately locked onto Theron holding the baby, and his face darkened with dangerous rage. "And exactly who is this person? Why is some complete stranger holding my son like he belongs here?" Theron carefully, protectively transferred Torin back to Jada's waiting arms before rising to his full, impressive height. Although both men clearly possessed wealth and success, the stark contrast between them was immediately apparent to everyone present. Edward's prosperity felt aggressively ostentatious and demanding of recognition, while Theron's presence radiated quiet, earned confidence, and deeply ingrained respect for others. "I'm Theron Amadeo," he stated simply, graciously extending his hand in a gesture of basic civility that Edward deliberately and rudely ignored. "I know exactly who you are," Edward sneered with unconcealed contempt. What I demand to understand is why you're interfering in my family's private medical emergency. Because your wife was completely alone and in active labor, and she desperately needed immediate assistance, Theron replied with calm control, though Jada could clearly observe the carefully restrained anger burning in his dark eyes. Dr. Reed stepped forward decisively, her previously warm professional demeanor becoming noticeably frigid. Mr. Williams, your wife endured an extremely difficult and potentially dangerous labor. She was terrified and completely abandoned when Mr. Amadeo brought her to our facility. Perhaps you should be expressing profound gratitude rather than conducting this hostile interrogation. Edward's face flushed brilliant red with embarrassment and rage. Don't you dare lecture me about my own family obligations, and I certainly don't require some self-appointed savior playing hero with my wife. He whirled toward Jada, his voice dropping to the patronizing, condescending tone she had learned to dread. Really, Jada? You couldn't possibly wait a few additional hours. You had to create this entire public spectacle and humiliate our family name. Jada felt something fundamental shift deep within her core, the identical strength that had sustained her through labor now rising fiercely to protect her innocent son from the toxic negativity that Edward brought into every environment. Humiliate our family? Edward, I was in agonizing labor for hours while you played cards and drank with your friends. I could have died along with our baby, and you wouldn't have discovered it until you needed fresh cigars. Stop being so ridiculously dramatic, Edward snapped dismissively. Women have been successfully giving birth for thousands of years without fanfare. You didn't need to involve complete strangers in our private family business. Theron took one measured step forward, his voice becoming deadly quiet. That private family business nearly resulted in your wife delivering alone on cold stone floors. Your supposedly dramatic wife crawled down an entire staircase while you were celebrating and laughing with your associates. The suffocating tension in the room became almost palpable until Dr. Reed professionally intervened. Gentlemen, this is a recovery room, and my patient requires rest and peace. Mr. Williams, there are official papers requiring your signature and important financial matters demanding immediate discussion. Mr. Amadeo, thank you sincerely for everything you've done, but perhaps it's appropriate for the family to have some private time. Theron nodded respectfully, but before departing, he approached Jada's bedside one final time. He withdrew an elegant business card from his wallet and placed it carefully on her bedside table. If you or Torin ever need absolutely anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me immediately. His warm hand briefly covered hers, and in that electric moment, Jada experienced a profound connection that had absolutely nothing to do with the dramatic circumstances of their initial meeting. This exceptional man had witnessed her at her most vulnerable and had responded with pure, selfless compassion. More significantly, he had treated her with the dignity and respect that she had somehow forgotten she fundamentally deserved. "Thank you," she whispered with heartfelt emotion, "for absolutely everything." After Theron's departure, the room immediately felt smaller, colder, and oppressive. Edward instantly launched into a harsh lecture about excessive hospital bills and the social embarrassment of having his business associates learn about the birth through social media rather than his personal announcement. "Do you possess any comprehension of what this little dramatic stunt is going to cost our family?" Edward demanded furiously, aggressively waving a detailed hospital bill that Dr. Reed had handed him. "Platinum care package? Private luxury room? Who authorized these outrageous expenses?" "The gentleman who brought your wife here covered all additional expenses," Dr. Reed replied with professional coolness. "Your insurance will handle the standard costs, but Mr. Amadeo personally guaranteed the upgraded care." Edward's face transformed from white to deep red as the implications registered. The devastating realization that another man, especially Theron Amadeo, had provided for his wife in ways that he either couldn't or wouldn't represent a crushing blow to his carefully constructed ego that Jada could observe him struggling desperately to process. "We don't need his condescending charity," Edward declared through clenched teeth. "It wasn't charity," Jada replied firmly, surprising herself with the newfound steel in her voice. "It was simple human kindness, something you might consider attempting sometime." As Edward continued his bitter tirade about proper procedures and family embarrassment, Jada gazed down at baby Torrin sleeping peacefully in her protective arms. Her precious son would never experience a world where he wasn't genuinely wanted, where his fundamental needs were considered secondary to someone else's selfish convenience, or where requesting help was viewed as unforgivable weakness. Glancing at Theron's business card resting on her bedside table, Jada made a solemn promise to herself and to her innocent son. Everything was going to change, dramatically. She didn't yet know exactly how or when, but the desperate woman who had crawled down unforgiving stone steps during labor was not the same strong woman who would be departing this hospital. The guardian angel in the expensive suit had revealed that genuinely good men still existed in the world. Men who understood that authentic strength meant protecting those requiring protection, not controlling those who depended on you for survival. As Atlanta awakened to a brilliant new day outside her hospital window, Jada Williams held her son close and began mentally planning their completely transformed new life. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Diamond Cage. 3 weeks after Torrin's dramatic birth, Jada discovered the crushing truth about her gilded prison when she found Edward frantically shredding financial documents in his home office at 2 in the morning, his face wild with panic as he destroyed evidence of the empire of lies that was finally crumbling around them both. "Edward," Jada called softly from the doorway, 6-week-old Torrin sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that his father was systematically destroying their family's financial future. "What are you doing?" Edward spun around like a cornered animal, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey and stress, expensive papers scattered around him like the remnants of broken dreams. "Nothing that concerns you, Jada. Go back to bed." But Jada had spent weeks watching Edward's increasingly erratic behavior, the hushed phone calls behind locked doors, the way he flinched whenever she mentioned purchasing anything for Torrin, the stack of unopened mail that grew larger each day. She stepped into the office, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Those look like bank statements," she observed, picking up one of the papers he'd missed. "Edward, what's happening to our finances?" "Our finances are fine," Edward snapped, but his voice cracked on the word fine, and Jada saw genuine terror in his eyes. "This is just reorganization, business adjustments." Jada looked at the partial statement in her hand, and the numbers made her stomach plummet. Negative balances, overdraft fees, past due notices. "Edward, this shows we're overdrawn by $40,000. How is that possible?" Edward's laugh was bitter and dangerous. 40,000? Jada, that's petty cash compared to what we actually owe." He gestured wildly at the destroyed papers. "The mortgage on this house is 3 months behind. The car payments are overdue. I owe $2 million to investors who are starting to ask uncomfortable questions." The magnitude of their financial devastation hit Jada like a physical blow. $2 million. "Edward, how did you lose $2 million? "I didn't lose it," Edward screamed, causing Torrin to startle awake with a frightened cry. "I invested it. I leveraged it. I used it to build something bigger." But then Hartwell pulled out, and Morrison's deal fell through, and suddenly everyone wants their money back at the same time. As Jada gently soothed Torrin back to sleep, She began understanding the scope of Edward's deception. "You've been gambling with money we don't have. You've been using this house, our home, as collateral for business deals without telling me." "I've been building our future," Edward roared. "Do you think this lifestyle pays for itself? Do you think houses like this and cars like ours just happen? I've been working 18-hour days trying to create the kind of wealth that would set us up for life." "By lying to me about everything," Jada said quietly. "By making me believe we were secure when we're actually bankrupt." Before Edward could respond, the melodious chime of the front doorbell echoed through the mansion. Edward's face went pale as death. "Who would be visiting at 2 a.m.? Jada asked, but Edward was already moving toward the door with the desperate urgency of someone who knew exactly who was calling. Jada followed, clutching Torin protectively, and watched as Edward opened the door to reveal two men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of quiet menace that money couldn't buy. "Mr. Williams," the taller man said with deceptive politeness, "we need to discuss your overdue obligations to our client." "Gentlemen, please," Edward said, his voice shaking. "I just need another week. The Pemberton deal is about to close, and then—" "The Pemberton deal fell through yesterday," the second man interrupted. "Our client is no longer interested in extensions or excuses. He wants his money, with interest, by Friday." Jada felt ice forming in her veins. These weren't bankers or lawyers. These were the kind of men who collected debts that banks wouldn't touch. "How much does he owe you?" she asked quietly. The men's eyes shifted to her with surprise, as if they hadn't expected Edward's wife to speak. $800,000, plus interest. Mrs. Williams, isn't it? "Jada, go upstairs," Edward ordered desperately. "This doesn't concern you." "Everything that affects our family concerns me," Jada replied with steel in her voice, "especially when it involves men who visit houses at 2 in the morning. The taller man smiled without warmth. "Your wife has good instincts, Mr. Williams. You should listen to her more often." After the men left with promises to return on Friday, Edward collapsed into one of the living room's silk chairs, like a man who had just watched his execution date being scheduled. $800,000 to loan sharks, Jada said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Edward, what have you done to our family?" "I was trying to save our family," Edward exploded. "When the banks wouldn't extend my credit, I had to find alternative financing. I thought I could triple the money and pay them back before anyone noticed." "Alternative financing," Jada repeated. "You mean borrowing money from criminals?" "They're not criminals, they're private investors," Edward said weakly, but even he seemed to understand how pathetic that sounded. The next morning brought Genevieve Sterling Williams, arriving with her usual impeccable timing and venomous charm. She settled into the living room like an elegant spider, claiming her web, her Chanel suit and diamond jewelry, a sharp contrast to the financial chaos surrounding them. "Jada, darling," Genevieve said with false sweetness, "I understand that Edward has finally shared the reality of your situation with you." "You knew about this?" Jada asked, adjusting Torin in her arms as her son gazed up at his grandmother with the serious expression that had become his trademark. "Of course I knew," Genevieve replied with casual cruelty. "Where do you think Edward learned to live beyond his means? Our family has always understood that appearances matter more than reality. The Williams name opens doors that money alone cannot." "But now we don't have money or good appearances," Jada pointed out. Genevieve's smile turned predatory, "which is why we need to discuss your role in solving this crisis." "My role? The prenuptial agreement you signed?" Genevieve said, producing a document from her purse with the flourish of someone revealing a winning hand. "It includes provisions that protect the Williams family assets in exactly this type of situation." Jada stared at the papers, her mind reeling. "I never signed a prenuptial agreement. I would remember something that important." "You signed dozens of documents during your wedding preparations," Genevieve said smoothly. "Marriage license, insurance forms, bank account changes. Edward simply included the prenup among the other paperwork. Very efficient, really. The betrayal hit Jada like a tsunami. You tricked me into signing away my legal rights without telling me what I was agreeing to? We protected you from unnecessary worry, Genevieve corrected, and now those protections will help us navigate this temporary financial difficulty. How exactly will they help? Jada demanded. Edward cleared his throat uncomfortably. The prenup includes provisions for separation of assets during financial crises. If we separate temporarily, legally speaking, my debts can't touch certain protected accounts. You want to divorce me to hide money from your creditors, Jada said with dawning horror. Not divorce, Genevieve said quickly. Legal separation. Temporary, of course, just until Edward can rebuild his portfolio. And what happens to Torin and me during this temporary separation? You would receive appropriate support, naturally, Genevieve said with the tone of someone discussing charity for the deserving poor. A modest apartment, basic living expenses, supervised visitation with Torin. Supervised visitation with my own son? Jada's voice was deadly quiet. Well, you are rather young and inexperienced as a mother, Genevieve observed, and given your recent emotional instability, it would be prudent to ensure proper oversight. Jada looked between Edward and his mother, finally understanding the scope of their manipulation. They had planned this betrayal long before the current crisis. The prenuptial agreement, the financial deception, even the way they had dismissed her concerns about Torin's feeding issues, it had all been calculated to make her dependent and controllable. You're trying to steal my son, she said with crystal clarity. Don't be dramatic, Edward said, but he couldn't meet her eyes. We're trying to protect our family during a difficult time. No, Jada replied, standing up with Torin in her arms. You're trying to protect yourselves by sacrificing me and my son, but I'm not the powerless girl you married anymore. Jada, you need to be realistic about your options, Genevieve said with false sympathy. You have no income, no assets, and a newborn baby. Without our support, what exactly do you think you can do? Jada looked down at Torin, who was gazing up at her with complete trust and love, and felt something steel-hard crystallize in her chest. I'm going to fight for my son, and I'm going to win. With what? Genevieve laughed. You have nothing. I have the truth, Jada said quietly, and I have people who believe in justice. As she walked upstairs to the nursery, Jada heard Genevieve's voice floating behind her. She'll come around. She has no choice. But sitting in the nursery with Torin in her arms, Jada reached for Theron's business card and made a decision that would have terrified her weeks earlier. She did have choices. They might not be easy choices, but she had options that Edward and Genevieve couldn't control. The diamond cage was beautiful, but it was still a cage built on lies and held together with manipulation, and Jada Williams was done being a prisoner in her own life. Outside the nursery window, Atlanta's skyline glittered with possibility, and somewhere in those lights was a man who had shown her that kindness and strength could coexist in the same person. For the first time since her wedding day, Jada allowed herself to imagine what life might look like if she chose truth over convenience, authenticity over appearance, and courage over comfort. The foundation of lies was cracking, and Jada was ready to build something real from the rubble. Chapter 4. Midnight Confessions. At 11:47 p.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday night, Jada Williams stood at her living room window watching Theron Amadeo's headlights cut through the darkness as he pulled into her circular driveway, carrying the specialized baby formula that had been impossible to find anywhere else in Atlanta at this hour. Torin had been struggling with feeding issues for 3 days, and when Jada had finally worked up the courage to call the number on Theron's business card, he'd answered on the first ring despite the late hour. She'd expected him to give her the name of a store, or maybe a contact who could help. Instead, he'd simply said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes, and hung up. You didn't have to come yourself, Jada said as she opened the front door, immediately noticing how Theron's expensive suit had been soaked by the short walk from his car. I just needed to know where I could find this particular formula. Theron smiled gently, shaking rain from his dark hair. My assistant would have taken 12 hours and 3 phone calls to track this down. I have a contact at Children's Healthcare who keeps emergency supplies. He handed her a small cooler bag. There's enough here for 2 weeks, plus some probiotic supplements that might help with his digestion. Jada felt tears spring to her eyes, not just from gratitude, but from the simple shock of being treated like her needs mattered. Theron, I don't know how to thank you. Edward is in Charleston on business, and his mother said I was being hysterical about Torrin's feeding schedule. Something dark flickered across Theron's features. Where's your husband when his son is having health issues? Closing a deal that he says will solve all our problems, Jada replied, then immediately felt disloyal for sharing Edward's business with a virtual stranger. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be discussing my marriage with you. You shouldn't have to handle a sick baby alone, Theron said simply. May I come in? I'd like to make sure this formula works before I leave. Jada hesitated for a moment, acutely aware that inviting another man into her home while her husband was away would provide Genevieve with enough ammunition for months of subtle warfare. But Torrin's soft crying from upstairs made the decision for her. Of course. Please. Theron followed her through the mansion's marble foyer, and Jada found herself seeing her home through his eyes, the ostentatious chandelier that Edward had insisted on, the abstract paintings that cost more than most people's annual salaries, the furniture that looked expensive but felt cold and uncomfortable. This is beautiful, Theron said politely, though Jada suspected he was being kind. It's Edward's vision, she replied, then added with surprising honesty, I always thought it looked like a hotel lobby. They climbed the sweeping staircase to the nursery, where Torrin was fussing in his Italian-made crib. Theron waited respectfully in the hallway while Jada prepared the specialized formula, but she found herself wanting his opinion, his presence, his calm energy in the room where she'd spent so many anxious hours feeling inadequate and alone. He's been eating, but then spitting up everything within an hour, Jada explained as she tested the formula's temperature. The pediatrician said it might be reflux, but the regular formulas aren't helping. My business partner's daughter had the same issue, Theron said, settling into the nursery's uncomfortable designer chair with an ease that Edward had never managed. This formula is specifically designed for sensitive digestive systems. It costs about 4 times more than regular formula, but it can make all the difference. As Jada fed Torrin the new formula, she was amazed to see her son drinking contentedly without the grimacing and fussing that had become routine. Within minutes, he was relaxed and sleepy, showing none of the discomfort that had been keeping them both awake for days. It's working, Jada whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and break the spell. Give it a few hours to be sure, Theron said, but the difference in his body language is already obvious. They sat in comfortable silence as Torrin finished his bottle and drifted off to sleep. Jada found herself studying Theron's face in the soft nursery lighting, the kind eyes that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him, the strong hands that had held her son with such natural gentleness, the quiet confidence that came from achieving success without losing his humanity. Can I ask you something? Jada said softly, placing Torrin back in his crib. Anything. Why did you help me that night? Really? You could have just ignored a text from a wrong number. Theron was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on sleeping Torrin. My mother raised me alone, he finally said. My father left when I was 4, and there were plenty of nights when she needed help that never came. I watched her struggle with medical emergencies, broken cars, bills she couldn't pay, and most of the time, people just looked the other way. He turned to meet Jada's eyes. I swore that when I had the resources to help someone the way my mother needed help, I would never look the other way. When I got your text, I heard my mother's voice. Jada felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared values that she hadn't experienced with anyone in years. What happened to your mother? She died my senior year of college, Theron said, his voice soft with old grief. Breast cancer. She fought for 2 years, working 3 jobs to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. I was studying business on a scholarship, working nights to send her money, but it wasn't enough. I'm so sorry, Jada whispered. She was the strongest person I've ever known, Theron continued. She taught me that real wealth isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you can give away without missing it. Everything I've built has been guided by her voice asking me, how does this help people who need help? They moved downstairs to the kitchen, where Jada made coffee and found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. Her dreams of expanding her design business into something meaningful, her growing realization that her marriage was built on control rather than partnership, her fears about raising Torin in an environment where appearances mattered more than authenticity. I used to design logos and marketing materials for small businesses, Jada said, curled up on the kitchen's leather banquette, while Theron sat across from her with his coffee. There was something beautiful about helping someone's dream become visually real. I had a client who started a non-profit for foster children, and I designed their entire brand identity for free. Seeing kids wearing t-shirts with logos I created, it felt more valuable than any paycheck. Why did you stop? Theron asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Edward convinced me that I didn't need to work anymore. He said it was his job to provide for me, and my job to create a beautiful home and raise beautiful children. Jada's laugh was bitter. I thought it was romantic at the time. Now I realize he was just collecting another beautiful object for his perfect life. What would you design now, if you could design anything? The question surprised Jada with its simplicity and possibility. I've been thinking about that lately, actually. I'd want to work with organizations that help women and children, domestic violence shelters, single mother support groups, childhood literacy programs. I'd want my work to make a difference, not just look pretty. Theron leaned forward slightly. Those organizations always need good design work, and most of them can't afford to pay market rates for quality branding. Exactly. I could charge my corporate clients full price to subsidize pro bono work for non-profits. I've actually sketched out some business plans. Jada trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about sharing dreams that Edward had dismissed as naive idealism. I'd love to see those plans sometime, Theron said seriously. I fund community development projects through my foundation, and one of our biggest challenges is connecting with quality creative professionals who understand our mission. They talked until nearly 3 a.m., sharing stories about their childhoods, their values, their dreams for making a positive impact in the world. Jada learned that Theron had built his fortune through sustainable housing developments that provided affordable homes without sacrificing quality or environmental responsibility. He learned that she'd grown up in a middle-class family where both parents worked multiple jobs to send her to art school, and that her happiest memories involved creating things that brought joy to other people. I should go, Theron finally said, glancing at his watch. You need sleep, and I have an early meeting. As they walked to the front door, Jada felt reluctant to end this conversation. The first real conversation she'd had with another adult in months. Theron, thank you for tonight. Not just the formula, but this. Talking like this. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone actually listen to my ideas. Your ideas are worth listening to, Jada. Anyone who doesn't see that is missing something important. They stood at the front door for a moment, rain still pattering against the windows. and Jada felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage, the sense that she was seen and valued for who she actually was, not who someone else wanted her to be. "Would you—" she began, then stopped, suddenly aware of the complexity of what she was about to ask. "Would I what? Would you be willing to look at those business plans I mentioned? I'd value your opinion if you have time." Theron smiled, the same gentle expression that had convinced her to trust him with her life weeks earlier. "I'd be honored to look at your plans, Jada. You have my number." After he left, Jada stood in her quiet kitchen, processing the evening. Upstairs, Torrin was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. In her heart, something that had been dormant for years was beginning to wake up. She wasn't just Edward Williams' wife, or Genevieve's disappointing daughter-in-law, or even just Torrin's mother. She was Jada Williams, a woman with talents, dreams, and the growing conviction that she deserved a life built on mutual respect rather than beautiful captivity. The midnight confession had revealed more than shared stories. It had revealed the possibility of a different kind of future. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. The morning that Jada's world began to crumble started with Edward's furious voice echoing through the mansion's marble halls, followed by the sharp crack of his phone hitting the kitchen wall as he screamed about ungrateful partners and broken promises that would ruin everything he'd worked to build. "Edward, what's wrong?" Jada asked, hurrying downstairs with 6-week-old Torrin in her arms, alarmed by the violence in her husband's voice. She'd heard him angry before, but this was different. The controlled facade that he usually maintained was completely shattered. Edward whirled around, his face red with rage and what Jada was beginning to recognize as panic. "What's wrong? What's wrong is that my biggest client just pulled out of a deal that was supposed to close yesterday. 8 months of work, gone. $2 million in commissions vanished." Jada felt her stomach drop. Edward's real estate investment firm had been struggling for months, though he'd insisted the problems were temporary. "Edward, I'm sure there are other what, Jada? Other miraculous solutions that will appear out of thin air?" Edward's laugh was bitter and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what this means? Do you understand what I've risked to maintain this lifestyle?" Before Jada could respond, the doorbell rang. Edward stalked to the front door and yanked it open to reveal Martellus Kane, Edward's lawyer and longtime friend. Martellus was a man who wore expensive suits like armor and had made his career helping wealthy men protect their assets from the consequences of their poor decisions. "Eddie, we need to talk," Martellus said grimly, glancing at Jada with the dismissive look she'd learned to expect from Edward's associates. "Privately." "Jada, take the baby upstairs," Edward ordered without looking at her. "This doesn't concern you." But Jada had spent 6 weeks listening to hushed phone calls, watching bills pile up, and feeling the growing tension that Edward thought he was hiding. "Actually, Edward, if this affects our family's finances, it does concern me." Marcellus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Williams, this is a complex business matter. Perhaps it would be better if..." "If what? If I pretended that I don't live here? If I acted like I don't have a newborn son whose future depends on understanding our family's financial situation?" Jada's voice was steadier than she felt, but something about holding Torrin gave her courage to demand answers. Edward's face darkened further. "Fine. You want to know how bad things are? Marcellus, tell my wife about our financial situation. Tell her what happens when you leverage everything you own to finance deals that fall through." Marcellus opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Mrs. Williams, your husband has used this house as collateral for several business loans. When his current deals were expected to close, this wouldn't have been a problem. However, with the Hartwell project falling through, there are some complications." "What kind of complications?" Jada asked, though she was beginning to understand that her beautiful prison was about to collapse around her. "We have 90 days to restructure Edward's debt, or the bank will begin foreclosure proceedings," Marcellus said, with the clinical detachment of someone delivering news that wouldn't affect his own life. Jada felt the blood drain from her face. "Foreclosure? Edward, you told me this house was paid for. You said it was our security." "It was security," Edward exploded. "It was collateral that allowed me to build a business that should have made us rich. How was I supposed to know that bastard Hartwell would get cold feet at the last minute?" "So we could lose our home?" Jada asked quietly. "We could lose everything," Marcellus confirmed. "The house, the cars, the investment accounts, everything has been leveraged to finance Edward's expansion plans." Jada sank into one of the living room's uncomfortable designer chairs, Torin stirring restlessly in her arms, as if sensing the chaos swirling around him. "What about my name on the house? Don't I have legal rights as your wife?" Edward and Marcellus exchanged a look that made Jada's blood run cold. "That's complicated," Marcellus said carefully. "When you and Edward married, you signed a prenuptial agreement that was quite comprehensive. Your rights to marital assets are limited under the terms of that agreement." "I never signed a prenuptial agreement," Jada said firmly. "I would have remembered something that important." Edward's face went white, then red. "Jada, you signed dozens of papers when we got married. The marriage license, insurance forms, bank account paperwork. You didn't read every single document." The realization hit Jada like a physical blow. "You hid a prenuptial agreement in our other paperwork. You made me sign away my rights without telling me what I was signing." "I protected both of us," Edward said defensively. "Prenups are standard for people in our position. I didn't want you to worry about legal complexities when you should have been focused on our relationship." "You lied to me," Jada whispered. "You tricked me into signing away my legal protections, and then you used our home as collateral without telling me. What else have you hidden from me?" Marcellus cleared his throat again. "Mrs. Williams, there's more we need to discuss. Edward's business difficulties have created a situation where certain difficult decisions need to be made." "What decisions?" Jada asked, though she dreaded the answer. Edward couldn't meet her eyes. "Jada, we need to discuss the possibility of separating, temporarily, just until I can get the business back on track." The words hit Jada like ice water. "You want a divorce? Now? When we have a 6-week-old baby and you've apparently bankrupted us?" "Not a divorce," Marcellus interjected smoothly. "A strategic separation that would protect certain assets and allow Edward to restructure his business debts without affecting the baby's future security." Jada looked between the two men, suddenly understanding that this conversation had been planned before Edward's client pulled out, before the current crisis, possibly before Torin was even born. "You planned this," she said slowly. "This isn't about the Hartwell deal falling through. You've been planning to leave me." Edward's silence was answer enough. "Edward, we have a son. Whatever problems you're having with your business, we should face them together as a family." "Jada, you don't understand the complexities involved here," Marcellus said patronizingly. "If Edward files for separation under the right circumstances, he can protect certain assets for Torin's benefit while restructuring the business debts. It's actually a smart financial strategy. For Edward, maybe. What about Torin and me?" "You would receive appropriate support, of course," Marcellus replied, sliding a document across the coffee table. "This separation agreement ensures that you're taken care of while Edward resolves his business difficulties." Jada looked at the document without touching it. "How long have you been planning this, Edward?" Edward finally met her eyes, and what she saw there was worse than anger or desperation. What she saw was cold calculation. "Jada, I married you because I loved you, but I also married you when I thought my business was stable. Things have changed. Things have changed because you made risky decisions without telling me. Things have changed because you leveraged our family's security for business deals. Things have changed because you've been lying to me for months, maybe years. I've been protecting you from worrying about things you couldn't help with anyway, Edward snapped. I've been trying to build a fortune that would take care of you and Torrin for life. By risking everything we already had, Jada replied. And now that your gambles have failed, you want to abandon your family to save yourself. Genevieve Williams chose that moment to arrive, sweeping through the front door with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to make her entrance. Jada, dear, I understand that Edward has explained the situation to you, Genevieve said with false sympathy. I want you to know that this is as difficult for the family as it is for you. Is it? Jada asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've all decided what's best for everyone except Torrin and me. Genevieve's mask slipped slightly. Jada, you need to be realistic about your situation. You have no income, no significant assets, and a newborn baby. Edward is offering you a generous settlement that will ensure you and the child are provided for. The child, Jada repeated. His name is Torrin, and he's Edward's son. Of course, Genevieve replied coolly, and Edward will always support his son appropriately. But you must understand that a man in Edward's position needs to make difficult choices to protect his family's long-term interests. Jada looked around the room at these three people who had apparently spent weeks or months planning her abandonment while she'd been caring for their newborn baby and trusting that her husband was working to secure their family's future. I need time to think about this, Jada said finally. Time is somewhat limited, Marcellus replied. The separation agreement needs to be signed within 48 hours to provide the legal protections that Edward's financial situation requires. As if on cue, Torrin began to cry, and Jada realized that her son was hungry, that it was time for his feeding, and that these people were asking her to make decisions about their entire future while she was exhausted and overwhelmed and had no one to advise her except the very people who were trying to manipulate her. I need to feed my son, Jada said, standing up, and I need to think about what's best for him, even if no one else in this room is willing to do that. As she walked upstairs to nurse Torrin, Jada heard Genevieve's voice carrying from the living room. She'll come around. She has no choice. But sitting in the nursery with Torrin in her arms, Jada realized that she did have choices. They might not be easy choices, and they might not be the choices that Edward and his family wanted her to make. But she had options. Looking at Theron's business card, still tucked into her dresser drawer, Jada made a decision that would have terrified her 6 weeks ago. She was going to fight for her son, for her future, and for the right to make her own choices about both. The unraveling was just beginning. Chapter 6. Finding Her Voice. The law offices of Elowen Sage and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown Atlanta high-rise, and as Jada stepped off the elevator holding 2-month-old Torrin, she felt like she was entering a battle she finally had the courage to fight. Mrs. Williams? The receptionist, a young black woman with natural hair and kind eyes, smiled warmly. Miss Sage is ready to see you. Can I get you anything? Water, coffee, a place to set up if you need to feed the baby? Jada had never been in a law office where the first consideration was her comfort and her child's needs rather than intimidation and power displays. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. Elowen Sage emerged from her office with the confidence of someone who had built her reputation by protecting people who others had underestimated. She was a woman in her 40s, impeccably dressed but approachable, with the kind of presence that suggested she could charm a jury one moment and destroy an opposing attorney the next. Jada, I'm so glad you called, Elowen said, shaking hands with genuine warmth, and this must be Torrin. He's beautiful. As if responding to his name, Torrin gurgled and smiled, immediately winning over every person in the office. Jada had learned that her son had a gift for melting hearts, a skill that would serve him well in life. Before we discuss your legal situation, I want you to know that this consultation is completely confidential, Elowen said as they settled into her office. Whatever you decide to do, nothing we discuss here will ever be shared with anyone without your explicit permission. Jada felt tears spring to her eyes. After weeks of having decisions made for her and being told what she should want, the simple acknowledgement of her right to privacy felt revolutionary. "How did you know to call me?" Elowen asked gently. "Theron Amadeo gave me your name," Jada replied. "He said you specialize in helping women who are facing difficult family situations." Elowen's expression warmed further. "Theron has referred several clients to me over the years. He has an excellent instinct for identifying people who need good legal representation." She paused. "He also mentioned that your husband and his family are pressuring you to sign separation papers without proper legal counsel. They say I have 48 hours to decide, and that if I don't sign, things will be much worse for Torin and me," Jada said, her voice steadier than she felt. Elowen's eyes flashed with professional anger. "That's a classic intimidation tactic. In reality, no legitimate legal agreement requires that kind of rushed decision-making. They're pressuring you because they know that if you have time to understand your actual rights, you might not agree to their terms." Over the next 2 hours, Elowen helped Jada understand the reality of her legal situation. The prenuptial agreement that Edward had hidden among their other wedding paperwork was problematic, but not insurmountable. More importantly, the financial records that Elowen's investigators had uncovered revealed a pattern of deception that went far beyond simple business mistakes. "Jada, I need to show you something that might be difficult to see," Elowen said, opening a thick file. "We've been investigating Edward's business practices, and we've discovered some concerning information." The document spread across Elowen's desk told a story that made Jada's stomach turn. Edward hadn't just made risky investments, he'd been using her design work, stolen from her old computer files, to pitch clients without her knowledge or consent. Logos she'd created during their engagement had been presented as Edward's work. Marketing concepts she'd developed as part of her portfolio had been sold to clients who had no idea they were purchasing stolen intellectual property. "He's been stealing my work," Jada whispered, staring at contracts bearing her designs, with Edward's signature claiming ownership. "For at least 2 years, Elowen confirmed. Possibly longer. He's made approximately $200,000 by selling your creative work as his own." Jada felt a cold fury settling in her chest. "So while he was telling me that my little art projects weren't worth pursuing, he was actually profiting from my work without telling me." "It gets worse," Elowen said gently. "We have evidence that he's planning to continue using your designs even after the separation. Part of his business restructuring plan involves launching a creative services division based entirely on work he stole from your portfolio." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that Jada almost couldn't process it. Edward hadn't just been a neglectful husband, he'd been systematically stealing from her while convincing her that her talents were worthless. "What can we do about this?" Jada asked, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Elowen smiled with the satisfaction of a lawyer who had found the perfect leverage. "We can do quite a lot. Theft of intellectual property is both a civil and criminal matter, copyright infringement, fraud, possibly RICO violations if we can prove that this was part of a systematic pattern of deception. RICO, racketeering laws. If Edward has been systematically stealing intellectual property and using it to defraud clients, that's organized criminal activity. The penalties are severe, and more importantly for your situation, any assets obtained through criminal activity can be seized and returned to the actual victims." Jada looked down at Torin, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that his father was a criminal who had been stealing from his mother. "What would you recommend?" "Fight," Elowen said simply. Fight for full custody, fight for your share of the marital assets, fight for compensation for the intellectual property theft, and fight to ensure that Edward faces consequences for his criminal behavior. But I don't have money to pay for a legal battle against someone like Edward. Elowen leaned forward. Jada, in cases involving intellectual property theft and fraud, we can often recover attorney's fees from the defendant. More importantly, several of Theron's non-profit organizations have legal defense funds specifically designed to help women in situations like yours. You wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. As if summoned by their conversation, Jada's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend, Aurelia Cross. Girl, you need to see the screenshots I just took. Edward's people have been asking questions about you at the hospital. I saved everything. Call me. May I? Elowen asked, and when Jada nodded, she put the call on speaker. Aurelia's voice filled the office with righteous fury. Jada, these people came to the hospital trying to find dirt on you. They wanted to know about your mental state after Torin's birth, whether you seemed unstable, whether anyone had concerns about your parenting. I told them exactly where they could stick their questions, but you need to know they're building some kind of case against you. Elowen's expression hardened. Aurelia, this is Elowen Sage, Jada's attorney. Would you be willing to make a formal statement about these inquiries? Hell yes, I'll make a statement. And I have documentation of every conversation, including the name of the private investigator who was asking questions and the law firm that hired him. After the call ended, Elowen looked at Jada with grim determination. They're not just trying to pressure you into a quick settlement. They're actively building a custody case designed to paint you as an unfit mother. This isn't about protecting Edward's business assets anymore. This is about taking your son away from you. The words hit Jada like a physical blow. Taking Torin away from her. The idea was so monstrous that she couldn't initially process it. They can't do that, she whispered. I'm a good mother. I've never done anything to harm Torin. Being a good mother isn't always enough when you're fighting people with unlimited resources and no scruples, Elowen said gently. But the good news is that we now know what they're planning, which means we can prepare our own strategy. What kind of strategy? Elowen's smile was predatory. The kind that turns their weapons against them. Every lie they tell, every piece of evidence they fabricate, every witness they try to buy, it all becomes evidence of their own criminal behavior. They're not just trying to steal your son, Jada. They're engaging in criminal conspiracy, and that gives us tools they don't expect us to have. As they concluded the meeting, Elowen handed Jada a thick packet of documents. I want you to read these carefully. They include your actual rights under Georgia law, regardless of that fraudulent prenuptial agreement. They also include information about protective services for women facing legal intimidation and resources for documenting any threats or harassment you might experience. What happens next? Jada asked. Next, we go on the offensive. We file for divorce on your terms, seeking full custody, equitable distribution of marital assets, and damages for intellectual property theft. We also file criminal complaints for fraud and copyright infringement. And we do it all before Edward's deadline expires, so he knows that his intimidation tactics have backfired spectacularly. Walking out of Elowen's office, Jada felt something she hadn't experienced since Torin's birth. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone wishing for rescue, but the powerful hope of someone who had found her weapons and was ready to fight. That evening, as she fed Torin his bottle and reviewed the legal documents Elowen had given her, Jada made a decision that would have been impossible weeks earlier. She was not going to sign Edward's separation agreement. She was not going to accept his characterization of her as a dependent who should be grateful for whatever scraps he chose to offer. And she was absolutely not going to allow anyone to take her son away from her. The scared young woman who had crawled down marble stairs in labor had found her voice, and she was about to use it. Chapter 7. the storm before peace. The confrontation that would change everything began at 6:30 a.m. on a Thursday morning when Edward burst into the nursery where Jada was feeding Torin, waving a legal document like a weapon and screaming accusations that echoed through the mansion's marble halls. "You vindictive bitch! How dare you file divorce papers without warning me? How dare you accuse me of criminal behavior when I've given you everything?" Torin startled at the shouting and began to cry, but Edward's rage made him oblivious to his son's distress. Jada automatically shifted to protect her baby, positioning herself between Edward and the crib while trying to soothe Torin back to calm. "Edward, please lower your voice. You're scaring the baby." "I don't give a damn about your schedule," Edward snarled, his face red with fury and what Jada now recognized as panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed my reputation, my business, my future, all because you couldn't be grateful for the life I gave you." Jada looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a man who had been living on borrowed time and stolen credit for so long that he'd forgotten the difference between earning something and taking it. His expensive suit couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes, and his accusations couldn't mask the fact that he was terrified of facing consequences for his actions. "Edward, I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped pretending that your lies were the truth." "Lies?" Edward laughed bitterly. "Everything I did was to build a future for our family. Every risk I took was to give you and Torin a life of luxury and security. You stole my work, Edward. For 2 years you've been selling my designs and keeping the money while telling me that my artistic career was worthless. That's not building a future. That's theft." Edward's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Your work? Jada, you created some pretty pictures on a computer. I turned them into business opportunities. I'm the one who found clients, negotiated contracts, managed relationships. You just doodled." The casual dismissal of her talent and effort revealed everything Jada needed to know about how Edward had always seen her. Not as a partner or even as a person with valuable skills, but as a source of free labor that he could exploit without acknowledgement or compensation. "Those pretty pictures earned you $200,000, Jada said quietly. "Money you used to fund your lifestyle while telling me we couldn't afford for me to restart my design business." "We're not having this conversation," Edward said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he expected absolute obedience. "You're going to call your lawyer and withdraw those papers. You're going to sign the separation agreement we offered you, and you're going to stop this destructive behavior before you ruin both our lives." "No," Jada said simply. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Edward stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "What did you say?" "I said no, Edward. I'm not withdrawing the divorce papers. I'm not signing your separation agreement. And I'm not going to continue pretending that your criminal behavior is my fault." Edward took a step closer, and for the first time in their marriage, Jada felt physically threatened by her husband. "Jada, you need to understand something. I have resources you can't imagine. I have lawyers who will destroy you in court. I have private investigators who will document every mistake you've ever made. And I have a family with connections that go back generations in this city. Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality to you," Edward said coldly. "You think that ambulance chaser lawyer you hired can compete with Marcellus Kane? You think some sob story about stolen artwork will impress a judge when I present evidence that you're an unstable mother who abandoned her newborn baby to a stranger?" Jada's blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" "The night you texted some random man to help deliver Torin," Edward said with malicious satisfaction. "What kind of mother puts her child in danger by accepting help from a complete stranger? What kind of woman invites another man into her home when her husband is away on business?" "Theron saved our lives when you abandoned us," Jada said, her voice shaking with anger. "He's been more of a father figure to Torin in 2 months than you've been since he was born." Edward's face went white with rage. "So you admit it. You've been having an affair with Theron Amadeo. You've been using our son to manipulate another man into supporting you." "I haven't been having an affair with anyone," Jada said firmly. "But even if I had been, it would be more honest than stealing from your wife while planning to abandon your family." Before Edward could respond, the doorbell rang. Moments later, Genevieve Williams swept into the nursery with Marcellus Kane behind her, both of them radiating the kind of cold fury that wealthy people deployed when their control was threatened. "Jada, dear, we need to discuss this unfortunate situation you've created," Genevieve said with false sweetness. "Your little tantrum has forced us to take steps we'd hoped to avoid." Marcellus opened his briefcase and pulled out another stack of legal documents. "Mrs. Williams, we're filing for emergency custody of the minor child, based on evidence of maternal instability and endangerment." Jada felt the world tilt around her. "You can't take my son away from me. I've done nothing wrong." "Haven't you?" Genevieve asked with malicious pleasure. "You've admitted to having a relationship with another man. You've made false accusations against your husband. You've demonstrated erratic behavior and poor judgment. The court will be very interested in hearing about your mental state." "My mental state?" Jada repeated, clutching Torin closer. "Postpartum depression is a serious condition," Marcellus said with clinical detachment. "When it leads to delusional thinking and inappropriate relationships with other men, the court has a responsibility to protect the child." Jada realized that they had been planning this attack for weeks, maybe longer. Every conversation, every moment of vulnerability, every time she'd tried to assert her rights. It had all been documented and twisted into evidence against her. "You're lying," she said. But even as she spoke, she understood how their lies would sound to a court that didn't know her. "Are we?" Edward asked. "We have documentation of your erratic behavior after Torin's birth. We have witnesses who will testify that you've been meeting secretly with another man. We have evidence that you've been making wild accusations about my business practices to justify your own infidelity." "None of that is true," Jada said desperately. "Truth is what we can prove in court," Marcellus replied coldly. "And we can prove that you're an unstable mother who has endangered her child and betrayed her family." Genevieve stepped forward with the satisfaction of someone delivering a killing blow. "Jada, dear, you can make this easy on yourself and Torin, or you can make it very difficult. If you sign the documents we've prepared, you'll have supervised visitation rights and a modest support allowance. If you continue this destructive behavior, you'll lose everything." Looking at these three people who had orchestrated her destruction while she'd been caring for their baby, Jada felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, but her last illusion that they were capable of basic human decency. "Get out of my son's nursery," she said quietly. "Excuse me?" Genevieve asked. "I said get out. This is still my home until a court says otherwise, and I want you out of my baby's room." Edward's face darkened. "Jada, you're making a serious mistake." "No," Jada replied, standing up with Torin in her arms and facing down three people who had spent weeks planning her destruction. "The mistake was trusting any of you to care about what was best for Torin, but I won't make that mistake again." As they filed out of the nursery, Marcellus turned back one final time. "Mrs. Williams, you have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, we'll be forced to take more aggressive action." After they left, Jada sat in the nursery holding her sleeping son and feeling the full weight of what she was facing. They had money, connections, and no scruples about destroying her to get what they wanted. She had Elowen Sage, Aurelia Cross, and the growing certainty that she would rather lose everything than surrender her child to people who saw him as a possession rather than a person. Her phone buzzed with a text from Theron. "Elowen told me about the custody threat. You and Torin are not alone in this fight." For the first time since Edward's morning attack, Jada allowed herself to hope. The storm was going to be terrible, but she was no longer facing it alone. And sometimes the most beautiful peace could only be found on the other side of the worst storms. Chapter 8. Gathering Storm Clouds. The courthouse at Fulton County Superior Court hummed with electricity as Jada Williams took her place beside Elowen Sage. 5-month-old Torin nestled securely in her arms while Edward's formidable legal team arranged their weapons of intimidation across the aisle, completely unaware that their carefully constructed lies were about to be demolished by the most devastating evidence they never saw coming. "Remember," Elowen whispered as they waited for Judge Lorelei Thorne to enter, "they're going to attempt psychological warfare, trying to paint you as unstable, manipulative, and unfit. Every word you speak, every expression you show, every gesture you make will be scrutinized. But we possess something they cannot anticipate or counter." "What's that?" Jada asked, gently adjusting Torin's position as he slept peacefully, blissfully unaware that his entire future was about to be decided in this room. "Irrefutable truth," Elowen replied, with quiet confidence that came from months of meticulous preparation, "and documented proof of their criminal conspiracy." Across the mahogany-paneled courtroom, Edward sat surrounded by Marcellus Kane and 3 additional attorneys, their combined legal firepower designed to intimidate as much as to advocate. Their expensive suits and leather briefcases created an impressive display of wealth and influence. Genevieve Williams occupied the front row behind them, dressed in funeral black, as if she were already mourning Jada's expected defeat. Judge Lorelei Thorne entered with the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years on the bench separating truth from performance art. She was a distinguished woman in her early 60s with silver hair and penetrating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The kind of judge who had witnessed every manipulation tactic and remained impressed by none of them. "This is a hearing regarding the custody of minor child Torin Atlas Williams," Judge Thorne announced with crisp authority. "Mr. Kane, you've filed motions seeking full custody on behalf of your client. Present your case." Marcellus Kane rose with theatrical gravity, his entire demeanor calculated to project confidence and moral authority. "Your Honor, we appear before you today because Mrs. Williams has demonstrated a disturbing pattern of behavior that places her infant son at significant risk. She has admitted to maintaining an inappropriate relationship with another man. She has made demonstrably false accusations against her husband to justify her own misconduct, and she has exhibited clear signs of severe postpartum depression that have compromised her judgment and parenting capacity." As Marcellus spoke with smooth authority, Jada felt the familiar sensation of having her reality rewritten by people who specialized in transforming truth into fiction. But this time, instead of feeling helpless, she felt the steady burn of righteous anger, the clean, powerful fury of someone who had been pushed beyond her breaking point. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Marcellus continued with practiced indignation, "on the night of the child's birth, Mrs. Williams endangered both herself and her infant by accepting assistance from a complete stranger rather than seeking proper medical attention. This demonstrates the kind of dangerously poor judgment that makes her unsuitable for unsupervised custody of any child." Judge Thorne's eyebrows rose with barely concealed skepticism. "Mr. Kane, are you seriously arguing that a woman in active labor seeking emergency assistance represents evidence of poor judgment?" "I'm arguing that a married woman who contacts unknown men for intimate assistance while her husband is conducting important business demonstrates questionable decision-making that extends far beyond that single incident, Your Honor." Elowen rose smoothly, her voice cutting through Marcellus's rhetoric like a blade through silk. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Kane is deliberately mischaracterizing life-saving emergency medical assistance as something inappropriate. Mrs. Williams was abandoned by her husband during active labor and made a desperate plea for help that preserved both her life and her child's life." "Sustained," Judge Thorne said with unmistakable dryness. "Mr. Kane, please confine yourself to factual evidence rather than inflammatory speculation," Marcellus called his first witness. Dr. Patricia Whitman, a psychiatrist who had never actually examined Jada, but who testified with impressive authority that based on comprehensive behavioral reports from Edward and Genevieve, Jada was likely suffering from severe postpartum depression with paranoid delusions. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Whitman declared with practiced conviction, Mrs. Williams' accusations against her husband, combined with her inappropriate relationship with another man, suggest a significant break from reality that could endanger her child's welfare. During cross-examination, Elowen systematically destroyed Dr. Whitman's credibility with surgical precision that was beautiful to witness. "Dr. Whitman, you've never actually examined Mrs. Williams personally, is that correct?" "That's correct. But I've reviewed extensive behavioral reports. Reports provided exclusively by people who are actively seeking custody of her child." "Well, yes, but these reports were comprehensive, and you're being compensated by Mr. Williams' legal team for this testimony today?" "I'm being compensated for my professional time and expertise, yes." "So you're being paid to provide a psychiatric opinion about someone you've never met, based exclusively on reports from people with a significant financial interest in the outcome of this case." Dr. Whitman's confident demeanor began cracking under Elowen's relentless questioning. "I'm providing my professional opinion based on available evidence. Evidence provided exclusively by people who want to take Mrs. Williams' child away from her," Elowen said with devastating finality. Edward took the witness stand next, presenting himself as a concerned father whose wife had become increasingly unstable after their son's birth. He spoke with practiced sincerity about Jada's erratic behavior, her wild accusations about his business practices, and her inappropriate relationship with Theron Amadeo. "Your Honor, I love my wife deeply, but I must prioritize what's best for Torrin," Edward said with the kind of emotional manipulation he had perfected over years of practice. "Jada has been making increasingly irrational claims about my business, and she's admitted to having an intimate relationship with another man. I'm genuinely afraid for my son's safety and emotional well-being." But when Elowen cross-examined Edward, his carefully constructed narrative began unraveling with spectacular speed. "Mr. Williams, you testified that you love your wife deeply. Is it your usual practice to abandon women you love during medical emergencies?" "I wasn't abandoning her. I was conducting critically important business." "Business that was more important than your wife giving birth to your son?" Edward's face flushed with defensive anger. "I didn't know the baby was coming that specific night." "Even though your wife had been in labor for hours and had repeatedly attempted to contact you. First babies typically take considerable time. There was no reason to think, Mr. Williams, are you a medical professional qualified to determine how long labor should take?" "No, but I have experience." "So when your wife informed you she was in labor, you decided that your business meeting was more important than her medical needs?" "That's not how the situation developed," Edward said, but his voice had lost its confident authority. Elowen produced a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Williams, let's discuss these business practices your wife has allegedly been making wild accusations about. Are you familiar with these contracts?" As Elowen methodically showed Edward document after document proving that he had stolen Jada's designs and sold them as his own original work, his testimony collapsed completely. He attempted to minimize the theft, then to justify it, then to blame Jada for not understanding how business operated in the real world. "So you admit that you appropriated your wife's creative work and sold it without her knowledge or consent?" Elowen asked with devastating clarity. "I transformed her amateur efforts into professional products," Edward said defensively. "You mean you stole her intellectual property and profited from it while telling her that her work was worthless?" I provided the business expertise that made her work commercially viable. Mr. Williams, theft doesn't become legitimate because you add business expertise to stolen goods. The courtroom was completely silent as Edward's credibility disintegrated under Eloan's methodical questioning. When she finished with him, he appeared less like a concerned father and more like an exposed criminal who had been caught red-handed. Dr. Callista Reed took the witness stand as Jada's first witness, and her testimony painted a completely different picture of the night Torrin was born. Mrs. Williams was in active labor when Mr. Amadeo brought her to our hospital, Dr. Reed testified with clear professional authority. She was frightened and in considerable pain, but she was completely lucid and focused entirely on the safety of her child. I observed no signs of mental instability or poor judgment. Quite the opposite. She made rational, appropriate decisions under extremely difficult circumstances. In your medical opinion, was Mrs. Williams's decision to seek help from Mr. Amadeo appropriate? Eloan asked. Absolutely appropriate. She was in active labor with no medical support available. Accepting help from anyone willing and able to provide it was exactly the correct decision. If she hadn't acted when she did, both she and the baby could have died. Aurelia Cross testified next, describing the private investigators who had attempted to gather damaging information about Jada and the way Edward's family had tried to bribe hospital staff to provide false testimony. They weren't interested in the truth, Aurelia said with passionate conviction. They were desperately searching for anything they could twist to make Jada look bad. When they couldn't find anything real, they started attempting to manufacture evidence. But the most powerful testimony came from Theron Amadeo himself. As he took the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Here was a man whose reputation for integrity was legendary, whose business practices were studied in ethics courses, whose charitable foundations had transformed communities throughout the Southeast. Mr. Amadeo, Eloan began, please describe your relationship with Mrs. Williams. Theron's voice was calm and clear as he described receiving Jada's desperate text, finding her in labor and completely alone, and staying with her through the delivery not out of inappropriate interest, but because he couldn't bear to leave a woman and child without support. I have no romantic relationship with Mrs. Williams, Theron said with firm conviction. My concern for her welfare stems from witnessing her extraordinary strength and courage under impossible circumstances, and from my profound respect for her as a mother and as a human being who deserved far better treatment than abandonment. Have you provided financial support to Mrs. Williams? I have paid her medical bills and connected her with legal representation. Yes. Why? Theron was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute moral conviction. Because I watched her crawl down marble stairs while in labor, abandoned by the people who should have protected her. Because I held her newborn son while she recovered from giving birth alone. Because I believe that children deserve to be with mothers who love them more than anything else in the world. And mothers deserve protection from people who see children as weapons to be used against them. He turned to look directly at Judge Thorne. Your Honor, I've encountered many people throughout my business career. I understand the difference between someone who is genuinely devoted to their child and someone who views children as possessions to be controlled. Jada Williams would sacrifice her life before allowing harm to come to her son. The people attempting to take him away from her see him as leverage to be used against her. The courtroom was utterly silent when Theron finished his testimony. Even Marcellus Kane seemed to understand that attacking Theron Amadeo's credibility would be like attempting to move a mountain with a feather. As the hearing concluded, Judge Thorne looked out over the courtroom with the expression of someone who had heard enough deception for one lifetime. I'll render my decision tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, she announced. Court is adjourned. Walking out of the courthouse, Jada felt like she had survived a grueling battle. But as Elowen had promised, the truth had been presented clearly and powerfully, and sometimes that was sufficient to change everything. The storm clouds were gathering for the final confrontation, but for the first time in months, Jada believed she could see sunlight breaking through the darkness on the horizon. Chapter 9. Truth in the Light. The silence that descended over courtroom 4B at exactly 9:02 a.m. was so profound that Jada Williams could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears as Judge Lorelei Thorne's penetrating gaze swept across the packed courtroom, her next words carrying the power to either reunite a mother with her child or destroy both their lives forever. "I have reached my decision regarding the custody of minor child Torrin Atlas Williams," Judge Thorne announced with the authority of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting the innocent from those who would exploit them. "This case has presented the court with a clear example of what happens when wealth and privilege attempt to manipulate the justice system to serve personal vendettas rather than the best interests of a child." Jada sat perfectly still beside Elowen Sage, 5-month-old Torrin, sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that his entire future hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Across the aisle, Edward's legal team maintained their confident posture, still believing that money and connections would ultimately triumph over truth and evidence. Judge Thorne's voice cut through the courtroom tension like a blade separating light from darkness. "After careful review of all testimony and evidence presented, I find that the emergency custody petition filed by Mr. Edward Williams is not only without merit, but represents a systematic campaign of lies, intimidation, and legal abuse that has no place in any courtroom." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the first crack appeared in Edward's certainty. His face went pale as the judge's words registered. "Mr. Kane," Judge Thorne continued with icy precision, "your client has presented this court with what can only be described as a coordinated effort to manufacture evidence, suborn perjury, and abuse the legal process. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that Mr. Williams abandoned his wife during a medical emergency, systematically stole her intellectual property for personal gain, and then attempted to weaponize the court system to punish her for seeking justice." Marcellus Kane half rose from his chair in shock. "Your Honor, if the court would consider—" "Sit down, Mr. Kane," Judge Thorne commanded, with the voice of someone who had silenced more powerful men than him. "You have presented this court with paid testimony from psychiatrists who never examined the defendant, private investigators who attempted to bribe hospital staff for false information, and a custody petition based entirely on fabricated evidence. I am not only appalled by the conduct of everyone involved in bringing this frivolous case, but I am referring several individuals to the State Bar for disciplinary proceedings." Jada felt tears of relief and vindication streaming down her face as Judge Thorne continued her devastating assessment. "The evidence presented clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Williams is not only a devoted and capable mother, but a woman who has shown remarkable courage and sound judgment under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Far from being unfit for custody, she represents exactly the kind of parent every child deserves, one who will fight for their welfare against any odds." Judge Thorne's attention turned to Edward with unmistakable contempt. "Mr. Williams, your conduct throughout these proceedings has been nothing short of despicable. You abandoned your wife during childbirth, stole her creative work for financial gain, and then attempted to use this court to complete your systematic destruction of her life. Your behavior demonstrates exactly why unsupervised access to this child would be contrary to his best interests." Edward shot to his feet, his face red with fury and desperation. "Your Honor, this is completely outrageous. You cannot possibly—" "Mr. Williams, sit down immediately," Judge Thorne commanded, with the authority of someone who would tolerate no further disruption. Your outburst only confirms that my assessment of your character has been entirely accurate. The judge's voice softened slightly as she addressed Jada directly. Mrs. Williams, I am granting you full temporary custody of your son, with the absolute right to relocate to housing of your choosing anywhere within the United States. I am also ordering that Mr. Williams provide immediate financial support for both you and the child, including complete reimbursement for all legal fees you have incurred defending against his frivolous and malicious petition. But Judge Thorne's justice was far from complete. Furthermore, based on the overwhelming evidence of intellectual property theft, fraud, and systematic deception presented in this case, I am immediately referring this matter to both the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service for tax fraud examination. The court finds probable cause that Mr. Williams has engaged in felony-level criminal activity that warrants aggressive prosecution. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as the full scope of Judge Thorne's ruling became clear. Edward wasn't just losing his custody battle, he was facing criminal charges that could result in decades of federal imprisonment. Genevieve Williams rose abruptly from her seat, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. This is an absolute travesty of justice. Our family has maintained standing in this community for generations. This manipulative woman has poisoned the court against us with her calculated lies. Judge Thorne's gaze settled on Genevieve with the force of a laser beam. Madam, if you are suggesting that family connections or social standing should influence decisions involving child welfare, you are gravely mistaken about how justice operates in my courtroom. Your family's behavior throughout these proceedings has been a textbook example of how privilege without moral character inevitably leads to corruption and destruction. The judge's voice rose with unmistakable anger. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting any member of the Williams family from contacting Mrs. Williams or her child except through court-approved channels. Any violation of this order will result in immediate incarceration for contempt of court. As Judge Thorne's gavel fell with the finality of thunder, ending the hearing, Jada felt something she hadn't experienced since the night Torrin was born, the absolute certainty that she and her son were not just safe, but completely free. Outside the courthouse, Elwyn Sage was practically glowing with professional triumph and personal satisfaction. I've been practicing family law for 20 years, and I have never witnessed a judge deliver such a comprehensive and decisive victory. Edward's entire legal team just experienced complete and total destruction. Theron Amadeo was waiting on the courthouse steps, his face showing profound relief and something deeper, a pride that had nothing to do with legal victory and everything to do with witnessing justice finally served. How does it feel to have won everything? He asked gently as Jada approached, still carrying Torrin against her chest. Like I can finally breathe again, Jada replied with honest emotion. Like the world makes sense again, and truth actually matters. Where will you go now? Theron asked with genuine interest. Judge Thorne said you have the right to relocate anywhere you choose. Jada looked down at Torrin, who had awakened and was gazing up at her with the serious, intelligent expression that never failed to melt her heart completely. I want to start completely fresh. Find a place that feels like home instead of a stage set designed to impress strangers. I might be able to help with that search, Theron said with a gentle smile that made Jada's heart skip with anticipation. I own several properties that are designed for families rather than showpieces, places where children can actually play without worrying about breaking expensive furniture that's more important than their happiness. As they talked, Aurelia Cross came running up the courthouse steps, having rushed over from the hospital during her lunch break to hear the verdict that would determine her best friend's future. Please tell me you won absolutely everything, Aurelia said breathlessly, her face showing the anxiety of someone who cared deeply about the outcome. We won everything that mattered, Jada said, still hardly believing the completeness of their victory. Aurelia let out a triumphant whoop that echoed off the courthouse walls and drew smiles from everyone within hearing distance. Justice! Finally! I knew that judge was too intelligent and experienced to fall for Edward's expensive lies. But their celebration was interrupted by the arrival of Edward himself, flanked by his remaining legal team and looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed into ruins around him. "This isn't over, Jada," Edward said, his voice shaking with rage, desperation, and the dawning realization of his complete defeat. "You think you've accomplished something significant, but you have no comprehension of what you've unleashed. My family possesses resources and connections you cannot imagine. We will appeal this biased decision. We will fight every criminal charge, and we will ensure that everyone understands what kind of vindictive woman you really are." Theron stepped forward slightly, not threateningly, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command respect and attention. "Edward, I believe it's time for you to accept reality and walk away with whatever dignity you have remaining. The court has spoken with unmistakable clarity, the evidence has been presented and evaluated, and your continued threats only confirm that Judge Thorne made exactly the right decision." "You!" Edward snarled, pointing at Theron with trembling fingers that betrayed his complete loss of control. "This entire disaster is your fault. If you hadn't interfered with my family, none of this destruction would have happened." "If I hadn't intervened," Theron replied with calm, devastating logic, "your wife and son might have died on your marble floors while you played poker and drank with your friends. The only thing I regret about this entire situation is that it took so long for the complete truth to emerge." Edward's face flushed red with impotent fury, but before he could formulate a response, Marcellus Kane placed a firm, restraining hand on his arm. "Edward, we need to leave immediately. Anything you say at this point could be used as evidence against you in the criminal proceedings that are now inevitable." As Edward's group retreated toward their expensive cars, Jada felt the last weight of fear and intimidation lift completely from her shoulders. For months, she had been terrified of these people, afraid of their money, their social connections, their apparent willingness to destroy her to achieve their goals. But standing in the warm sunlight outside the courthouse, holding her son and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her welfare and happiness, she realized that she was no longer afraid of anything. "What happens next?" she asked Eloan with genuine curiosity rather than anxiety. "Next, we complete the divorce proceedings entirely on your terms," Eloan replied with deep satisfaction. "With today's ruling, Edward has absolutely no leverage remaining. He will be forced to accept whatever settlement terms we choose to offer or face the prospect of going to trial before a judge who has already seen through every one of his lies." "And the criminal charges?" Jada asked. "Those proceedings are now beyond our direct control, but I strongly suspect the district attorney will be extremely interested in the intellectual property theft evidence we've compiled. White-collar crime prosecution has become a major priority, especially when it involves systematic fraud and racketeering." As they prepared to leave the courthouse behind forever, Theron approached Jada with an expression that combined admiration, respect, and something deeper that made her heart race with possibility. "I want you to know how much I admire your courage throughout this entire ordeal," Theron said with sincere emotion. "You could have accepted Edward's settlement and avoided this painful battle, but you chose to fight for what was right and just. That required extraordinary strength and character." Jada looked into Theron's eyes and saw something she had never experienced in Edward's gaze. Genuine respect for her as a complete person, not as a possession or an accessory to someone else's ambitions. "I couldn't have survived this without you and everyone who stood beside me. I thought I was completely alone, but it turns out I was never truly alone at all." "You're certainly not alone now," Theron said with a smile that promised infinite possibilities for their future together. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Jada carrying Torin with pride and relief, Elowen practically glowing with legal triumph, Aurelia texting everyone she knew about the victory, and Theron walking beside them with quiet satisfaction, Jada realized that this moment represented far more than the end of a legal battle. This was the beginning of the authentic life she had always deserved, but had been afraid to fight for until now. The truth had finally been heard, acknowledged, and vindicated, and it had set them all free to build something beautiful from the ashes of Edward's destruction. Chapter 10. Crown of Victories. The moment Jada Williams realized her fairy tale was finally beginning came 6 months after her courtroom triumph, as she stood in her thriving design studio, watching Atlanta's sunset paint the sky in shades of gold, while 8-month-old Torin babbled joyfully in his carrier, surrounded by the creative energy of a woman who had transformed pain into purpose. "Mama's officially changing the world, baby boy," Jada whispered to her son. Tonight marked the grand opening of Phoenix Creative Studio, the design business that had risen from the ashes of her old life, specializing in branding for non-profit organizations and social justice causes. The converted warehouse in Atlanta's Arts District featured warm, exposed brick walls adorned with Jada's artwork, comfortable furniture where clients could genuinely collaborate, and a play area where Torin could safely explore while his mother built something extraordinary. "The catering team has arrived," announced Aurelia Cross, who had accepted a part-time position as Phoenix Creative's client relations manager. "And honey, these people understand how to make food that's both beautiful and delicious." "How many people are we expecting?" Jada asked. 307, Aurelia replied with obvious pride, including the mayor, city council members, reporters from major publications, and documentary filmmakers. Defeating Atlanta's most notorious white-collar criminal while building a successful business makes you something of a local hero. Edward's criminal trial had concluded with convictions on 23 federal counts. He'd been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Genevieve Williams had relocated permanently to Charleston, claiming she couldn't endure the social humiliation. "I still find it difficult to believe it's truly over," Jada said, touching the finalized divorce decree. "It's not over," said a beloved voice from the entrance. "It's just beginning." Theron Amadeo entered with an enormous bouquet of sunflowers, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit but radiating warmth and affection that had everything to do with profound love. "You didn't need to bring flowers," Jada protested, though her heart skipped as always. "Actually, I absolutely did," Theron replied with a smile that reminded Jada why sunflowers turned toward light. "I have incredible news. Phoenix Creative just landed the largest non-profit branding contract in Atlanta's history. The Amadeo Foundation approved funding for 15 non-profits, 24 months of work, and a budget substantial enough to hire a complete professional staff." Jada stared in amazement. "That's absolutely incredible. But are you certain about working with me professionally?" "I'm intelligent enough to hire the most talented designer in the city for the most important work my foundation has ever undertaken," Theron replied firmly. The studio began filling with guests, a vibrant mix of artists, activists, business leaders, and community organizers united by their commitment to making Atlanta better for everyone. Dr. Callista Reed arrived with her family, immediately gravitating toward Torin. Judge Lorelei Thorne appeared with her wife, both radiating satisfaction from helping justice prevail. "This is extraordinary," Judge Thorne said, admiring portfolio displays showcasing Phoenix Creative's work with domestic violence shelters and community programs. "You're giving powerful voice to organizations that change lives." "That's exactly the point," Jada replied. "I spent too many years creating beautiful things that didn't matter. Now I want my work to mean something transformative. As the evening progressed, Jada moved through the crowd with increasing confidence, discussing projects with clients who saw her as a respected creative professional. Every conversation reinforced that she had discovered her true calling. "Speech! Speech!" someone called, and soon the entire room chanted encouragement. Standing before the crowd with Torin in her arms, Jada felt nervous excitement from stepping into her own power. "Exactly 1 year ago, I believed my life was over," she began steadily. "I was trapped in a marriage that appeared perfect but was destroying my spirit. I had surrendered my dreams, independence, and voice because I mistakenly thought that was what love required." The room fell silent, understanding they were witnessing something profound. "But then my son decided to be born on a night when I had no one except a stranger who turned out to be the most important answer to prayer I've ever received." Her eyes found Theron, tears streaming down his face. "That night taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And authentic love doesn't require making yourself smaller. It empowers you to become everything you're meant to be." Applause rippled through the room. "Phoenix Creative exists because I learned that survival isn't sufficient. We don't just escape things that hurt us. We transform them into something beautiful. Every organization we work with does exactly that, taking broken systems and building something better. That's what this studio represents, rising from whatever tried to destroy us and creating something extraordinary." As applause swelled, Torin clapped his tiny hands. The sight of mother and son together, strong and free and surrounded by love, moved people to tears. After formal speeches concluded, Theron approached with profound seriousness. "Can we talk privately?" he asked. They stepped onto the small balcony where Atlanta's lights sparkled below like earthbound stars. Torin had fallen asleep, peaceful and secure. "Jada," Theron began, gathering courage, "I need to tell you something I've wanted to say for months." "What is it?" Jada asked, her heart racing. "I love you," Theron said with simple honesty. "Not because I rescued you or because of dramatic circumstances. I love you because you're the strongest, most creative, most compassionate person I've ever known. I love watching you transform pain into purpose. I love the devoted mother you are to Torin, and I love the extraordinary woman you've become." Jada felt tears streaming as she heard words celebrating her strength rather than compliance, independence rather than dependence. "Theron," she whispered emotionally, "I love you too. I think I've loved you since the night you carried me to the hospital, but I was too afraid to believe someone could love me for who I actually am." "You were never broken," Theron said gently, touching her face with infinite tenderness. "You were trapped, and now you're completely free." When they kissed, it felt like completing a journey from crisis to triumph. It was the kiss of two people ready to build something beautiful together. "What happens now?" Jada asked, resting her forehead against his. "Now," Theron said with a smile promising forever, "we build the life we both deserve, together, as partners, as family." As they embraced while Atlanta sparkled below, Jada realized the frightened woman who had sent a desperate text to a wrong number no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had fought for justice and won, built a business based on values, and raised a son understanding that love meant freedom rather than control. The mistaken text had led to the right life. For the first time since she could remember, Jada Williams felt like the heroine of her own story. Inside, the celebration continued as Phoenix Creative launched its mission to give voice to those needing to be heard. Outside, three people who had found each other through courage stood together under Atlanta stars, ready to write the next chapter of a love story that had transformed them all. The diamond cage had been shattered completely, and from its ruins had risen something infinitely more valuable. A life built on authenticity, mutual respect, and unshakable knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful destinations could only be reached by traveling through the darkest storms. Justice had been served, love had triumphed, and Jada Williams had finally claimed her crown as the author of her own happily ever after. The wrong text had become the most right thing that ever happened, leading her home to herself and to a love worth fighting for.